much for having me. I'd like to thank Tufts and the Hoke family for all the support and the terrific opportunity to present on our work. My name is Ben Dobson. I'm the director of Hudson Carbon. We are a farm-based research entity, and we represent now clients, farmers and foresters and land stewards to quantify the carbon in their soils, in their forests, and we're beginning to add more ecological service measurements. What I'm really wanting to focus on today is the role that regenerative organic agriculture, and by organic I mean agriculture that increases organic matter in the soil, how it plays a role in cleaning supply chains and also mitigating climate change. So that's really gonna be the focus of my conversation today, and I'm just gonna move on to the next slide here. So we focus on regenerative organic agriculture. And what does that mean? Regenerative organic agriculture is really an alternative to commodity corn, soy, and wheat production that instead of driving high yields and negative ecological outcomes, provides sustainable yields and positive ecological and social outcomes. So really, as farmers and agriculturalists, we are now across the world, and we're managing 50 to 60% of the Earth's surface to produce food for people. And a tremendous amount of that surface is producing food for animals that we then eat. And the supply chains that have been built around this industrial system only add to the problem. So the real focus of our work in regenerative agriculture is to link best management practices and management outcomes on the ground to the production of good food that also helps mitigate climate, greenhouse gas emissions, human health problems, and climate health problems down the supply chain. This first slide I'm showing you is in our first year of transition, these fields had been used to grow GMO corn and soy. And this is a cover, and previously they would use herbicides to kill any weeds and plant a resistant corn and soy into that land. And then they'd spray it again so that only the corn and soy could live. And we developed, in partnership with Rodale, an approach to organic no-till, where we would grow these really large cover crops you see, of mainly rye and vetch, cover crops to bring soil carbon, fix nitrogen, hold water in the soil, and protect from weeds. And so really going to walk you through now practices like this that really provided that we've studied and with Hudson Carbon, but from the agricultural perspective, provide an alternative to the status quo of how we manage large-based grain and land systems now. This is, I wanted to show you a result of organic no-till agriculture, where we don't use tillage. When we till, we release a lot of carbon into the air. We damage a lot of the soil's life structure. So you can see these rows of soybeans coming up through a mat of cover crops. And what these cover crops do is they're replacing herbicides, they're replacing many of the fertilizers, and you can see we're still getting a very clean crop there. And in another part of our work, and it was really practice-based, was how do we, when we're managing the Earth's surface and we want to think about how our farms relate to climate change, all of the carbon in the atmosphere has been really managed by photosynthesis. 3.8 billion years ago, the atmosphere was 95% carbon dioxide. And the advent of the first photosynthetic plants and organisms enabled the planet to slowly bring that level of carbon dioxide down to just 280 parts per million 200 years ago. It's now back up to 420, but we have to remember that the Earth's surface and our soils and the forests and plants on them they mitigate our atmospheric greenhouse gas cycle. So when we're farming, I want to explain how that really focuses how we farm. If you see in this top middle frame, the golden wheat with the green clover underneath, around the world in commodity agriculture, when there's a small grain or a crop, we grow one crop at a time and we use herbicides, so there's nothing green underneath. Under this wheat, we actually strategically applied the cover crop, this green clover underneath, so that we would be collecting sunlight and fixing nitrogen while the wheat was no longer photosynthesizing. So we spread this clover at the beginning of the wheat's life cycle and didn't grow very much until the wheat started to die and get ready for harvest. Then the clover surged in and took the place of the wheat at photosynthesizing, bringing carbon, and also, since it's a leguminous crop, fixing nitrogen into the soils. It also prevents the need for herbicides or tillage after the harvest of a small grain. And then the following year, you can turn the clovers in and go to a more cash crop like a corn. So that practice is called frost seeding and undersowing. And it's this is a further example where you can see this red machine is actually harvesting the wheat. And underneath, you can see all that green. Those aren't weeds. That's already the next crop, photosynthesizing and building the soil health. So these are a lot of the types of activities. When you hear these catchphrases, regenerative agriculture or even organic agriculture, we like to describe it as really our management of our farming areas, where we're managing for food production to provide ecosystem services and improvements to soil health. I'm going to move down to this next slide. And another huge part of what we're bringing in regenerative agriculture is biodiversity back to the soil. So when we think of biodiversity, we often think of it as, and it includes all of these things, but of different plants or different birds or species, but really underneath our feet is a whole world of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and many more, nematodes that really provide a foundational aspect to life. And many of the bacteria and fungi that exist in the soil exist in other living beings or parts of the ecosystem. For example, many of the same bacteria in our stomach exist in the soil. So you can really start to connect what's a healthy soil, what's a healthy human. And to really drive that and keep that soil microbiome healthy and all the diversity there, we need to feed it. And the way that it's fed is using plants and crops. So when plants when they photosynthesize, they bring in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They need magnesium, and then they also need water. And in their chloroplasts, they produce carbohydrates, not only to build the plant, but they exude the excess carbohydrates, usually in the form of sugars, out of their roots into the soil microbiome. And that's the primary food source for all the biodiversity under our feet. And another reason why cover cropping and maintaining diverse living surfaces on all of our land, especially agricultural land, is critical to our climate cycle and really the very nature of biodiversity itself. A big thing we've worked on in agriculture is just trying to move the needle away from just a corn and soy rotation, but move it in a way that is applicable at large scale, where larger farmers that are really in the commodity markets can understand the added aspects to the rotation that we suggest. And you can see in this biodiversity, the diversification of a crop rotation, what we really like to do is more complex, but what we've really worked with farmers is something that they can move to. So the first step of adding to corn and soy is that you can see over on the right, adding a small grain, where these small grains allow that opportunity to then plant a cover crop or seed down to a 2 or 3 year perennial period, where the fields are not tilled, where it's the same mix of perennial crops that'll go dormant in the winter and be available for making hay or grazing in the summer periods. These perennials are essential to driving soil biology, controlling weeds, and building carbon in our soils, and to helping mitigate climate change. They're also a major opportunity for us to think about the supply chains of corn and soy, where in that system, the animals are living in contained animal feeding operations. Many of you have probably seen pictures of these huge feedlots, places where thousands of cows live on concrete and eat all day in manure where they're standing, and the manure ends up in lagoons. The same for hog factories or poultry factories. And what we do is we grow the corn and soybean and we drive it to these feedlots. Whereas in a much more holistic system, there's a role for animal agriculture, but it has to be very well defined, with animals as part of a landscape, so that it's frankly asinine that the whole world is on fire and we're growing soybeans and corn to ship all around the world to feed too many animals in factories, when actually properly managing the animals on the landscape, and that's where this perennial piece comes in, makes most of their diet grass or grass-based. And ruminants, especially cattle, goats, sheep, barely need, if at all, any grain in their diet. Whereas, grain is needed by hogs and chickens, but they're much more efficient And if you bring the hogs and chickens to the landscape in this 2 or 3 year perennial seed down, it creates a major opportunity for cycling nutrients and carbon properly. But what does that look like at a global scale? It would look like us eating less meat. So really eating appropriately raised meat that fits within the ecosystems. And this ties over pretty neatly into nutrient management. To talk about this overall impact of agriculture, not only do we impact the climate in the way we grow, in the carbon cycle, in the way we grow these crops. We first, often good ecosystems, grasslands or forests are cleared to grow corn and soybeans. Then further carbon's released from the soil. But we also add excess nutrients to these crops that ends up leaching into waterways, or specifically with nitrogen, turning into nitrous oxide, the most powerful greenhouse gas pollutant there is, and nitrates leaching into waterways. So what we really need to foster is nutrient management where we use the soil, use plants, root exudates, and soil microbiology to deliver nutrients to plants. And what you see in these pictures are my wacky compost tea brewing systems. And what we do there is we actually culture microbes and fungi that we then put in through conventional farm equipment. Where you'd put in conventional liquid fertilizer, we add microbial life in the form of compost teas. And these microbes help cycle nitrogen more efficiently, release phosphorus to make them available to plants, and build healthier root systems that can better capture nutrients available in the soil. And these are much more, so we're really trying to build the soil web to bring more fungi in and healthy bacteria to actually cycle our nutrients and start moving away. We've fully moved away in this farm from the use of synthetic nitrogens. Up to 10% of the emissions in the United States come from actually nitrous oxide. It's a pretty well hidden fact, but we have major problems around our nitrogen fertilizer. And on top of its off-gassing the atmosphere, it's polluting our waterways. So this sort of trying to frame what we do is we use compost teas, crop rotations to build our nutrient cycles. Sorry, I'm trying to go down one slide here. And then there are several tools we can use to watch nutrient management. So we do a lot at our farm with remote sensing from satellite. This is we're going to cross over from explaining some of the farming practices to how we start to measure them. This is a good crossover slide. But really, when we're looking at understanding crop health and productivity vis-a-vis the practices we've been using, we use a series of measuring tools. One of them is satellite data, and another is drone data, and then another is direct measurement. And we use all three to calibrate one another and build in. This is simply a yield map using ENDVI. And we were able to really highlight where crops were strong, where they were weak. And the two primary things it's related to is, if you'll see the area on the right-hand side, this was a set of the practices where you see much more green and higher yields. This is where we used a full rotation with perennial crops. And then on the left, you can see these red and yellow stripes and some patchy green. And that's actually an aerial imagery of the yields of a multi-series trial we did on the same corn crop that we had on the right with University of Pennsylvania on different annual cover cropping blends and different practices. And the right was the control with our Hudson Carbon prescribed practices. So this is just a rudimentary demonstration of how some satellite imagery can really help you see trends that are going on from the air, on the ground, but you see them from the air. Before we move on to measurement, this is a slide that really supports what I was talking about with animals earlier. On the left here, you can see a herd of cattle just in the spring on permanent pasture. But on the right, you see this frame where there are a few cattle on the left. We ultimately moved them in a much larger group. I'm talking about the upper right slide into the cover crop, where you see the purple and light green and gray color on the right. And we grazed that entire cover crop with animals, and their manure then fertilized that land, and then we planted a grain. So we managed to use animals to manage part of the nutrient cycle, and we got the animals their food directly from the field instead of harvesting their food and bringing it to a feedlot. Another key practice that sort of really where in the world of regeneration we're looking to and it's been identified in many major climate studies, is even moving beyond just the shift of what we grow on the fields and the mix of annuals, cover crops, and perennials. But how do we actually design the landscape to optimize for our water use and efficiency and infiltration? And how do we incorporate more woody carbon in the stalks and trunks of trees and woody plants? As we move our landscapes from conventional to regenerative, or I should say into being true ecological assets as opposed to liabilities, we really want our food production systems to increase soil carbon stocks by bringing atmospheric carbon dioxide in, increasing carbon stocks in woody biomass by doing the same, and increasing our water use efficiency and infiltration. In the Northeast, we often see, this is important here because we get too much water and flooding. But in environments that Hudson Carbon is working on, such as in Montana and in Mexico, infiltration is critical because it means that we need to manage for soil conditions that capture every possible inch of rain for that ecosystem to use through the dry period of its year. So a lot of the accomplishing this comes down to how we design our landscapes and organize the shapes of fields. So I'm going to explain sort of how this design, when we're impacting land, going from sort of conventional to regenerative, what we want it to look like. If you look at this slide here, you'll see the top it's the drawn slide on the upper left. The top represents sort of unhealthy grass. The shorter the plant, the shallower the roots grow. The second figure shows how with a tool called a keyline plow, it doesn't invert the soil. It's actually just loosening soil layers and allowing for better root growth. How a first pass allows those plants' roots to drive deeper and create new biological zones. And then how a second and third subsequent pass drive larger root systems and more extensive capture of nutrient, but also and more water. This keyline strategy also comes with a field shape plan that correlates with topography. Trying to change to my next slide here. My apologies here.
Ben, I think you're muted.
In this system, you can sort of use this slide to visualize what it looks like. Where instead of having just fields of one crop, we start integrating. This is a system in France that's pretty well known and well studied, where you're starting to have tree crops and field crops integrated, so that you're really providing major environmental benefits for insects, for birds, for water infiltration. And while you're taking some reduced yield on the agricultural commodity, you're really turning a farm landscape into an ecological asset. And this is a really critical concept that we focus on at Hudson Carbon. I'm going to move into to explain a bit about our work of Hudson Carbon and how we've been measuring these farm landscapes to really start driving results, to really start thinking about how we can use measurement technology, verification technology, to start bringing new revenue streams to land stewards, farmers, foresters, and others, to really help financing the change that we need and valuing ecological function in a financially, but also ethically. So at Hudson Carbon, we started in 2015. At the same time, we had just embarked on a very large organic transition on 3,000 acres in the Hudson Valley. These are a Stonehouse Farm in Mud Creek. It's all the pictures I showed you. And the focus of our work was to understand carbon, and initially it's been expanding, but how do we understand carbon and nitrogen flux in soil, plant biomass, the atmosphere, and in water? And what we first started with was soil. We found that across many of the land grant universities and across the agricultural sector, the real drive to focus on fewer and fewer commodity crops also led to a more simple and limited focus to looking at soil and its health and also the carbon in it. So what I'm showing you here is the initial design process we undertook to determine several sites around the farm where we would test our soil down to the depth of 1 meter. In a lot of the work that was being done, it was just agronomics. So farmers were being told, well, test your soil at 6 inches or 12 inches, because that's where your corn and soy roots will go. Well, in an organic and regenerative system, we're focused on driving roots and changes in carbon stocks as deeply as possible. So we measure our soil carbon to the depth of 1 meter. And this grid that looks sort of complicated is actually a 10-year sampling design that we apply to each of our soil coring sites, so that we're in the same area, and one sampling is actually 3 cores at a time. Just trying to get to this next slide. We're having, there we go. The other focus we take is on biomass sampling. So every month of the year at several of our sites, we measure the growth of the biomass, and we do it randomly. We don't come back to the same circle where we just harvested. And then we take carbon to nitrogen measures, species measurements, and total carbon content in the above ground biomass. And that's a really helpful tool in correlating and understanding changes below ground in the soil carbon testing. This is an example of our soil coring rig. We now have one that's truck mounted, so we can work in farms all over the Northeast. But this actually pulls a 1 meter core of soil. And on the right-hand frame, you can see that core of soil on the laboratory bench. And what we do is we cut that soil core, and I'm happy to share with you guys at Tufts our full soil methodology that we've developed on our own and with help from MBL and others. But I'll explain it briefly now. Here's 1 meter of soil. And on the right hand of that wooden box, you can see the soil is much darker. That's the topsoil. We cut that darker section into 3 subsections. And then we go into sort of the middle zone between 30 and 60 centimeters. And that's where we're seeing the most sustained gains and holding of carbon with less flux. And then we measure the deeper soil carbon. And this is, as simple as it may sound, it's actually been very interesting because the density of soil increases greatly as the core gets deeper. It also, the carbon storage capacity and the longevity of carbon changes the deeper you go. But also, we found that with a lot of complex types of analysis and data, that a lot of the status, the accepted data around the relationship of organic matter to carbon doesn't apply as well in deeper soil horizons. So deep soil carbon and how to drive carbon there and store it there has become a major focus of our work and a major source of hope for where regenerative agriculture and good practices in agro-ecological systems can really drive carbon sequestration and storage in this deeper soil profile. So really from the bottom 2/3 of this core heading to the left. I'm going to the next slide here. Another system that we use is in the areas where we're making detailed measurements on soil and biomass. We're looking at more systematic conditions. So what we work with a method called eddy covariance. We're fortunate enough to work with the team at Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory, led by Jim Tang, backed up by executive director, to actually deploy some of the first eddy covariance towers in agricultural settings in the United States, if not the first ones. I'm not going to make the claim that but we were early on, and we've been collecting data. What these methods do is they measure wind velocity and direction. We have other tools connected to them that measure daily solar radiation, PAR, as well, and we're also measuring we have a weather station on site measuring temperature, humidity, in addition to the wind direction. And then the eddy covariance method itself has 2 infrared lenses pointing at one another that count the CO2 molecules going between them, and we also have them for methane. And they're set up at an altitude that measures a localized ecosystem. So we have 5 years of direct data on a perennial, adaptively managed, meaning the animals are moved frequently to maximize grass and pasture conditions on a perennial pasture. We have one there. We have an eddy covariance tower set up nearby on an organic rotation, and a third one on a conventional control with a neighboring conventional farm growing just conventional crops. And into our 5th year of measuring the climatic conditions, the overall CO2 and fluxes in and out of these fields, we also test soil and biomass at these same locations. And this work is all really helping us build up into a model-based approach to understanding the total impact on the carbon cycle, and also methane. We use chamber flux, and on one eddy flux tower where we do the grazing, a methane sensor to understand the impact of our work on the methane cycle as well. And we feel this is really important because we envision a future where these ecological measurements become as accurate as possible, while also becoming scalable to landscape scale, measurable in a fast time frame, and so they can inform markets and decision makers. And we feel that the direct measurements in the soil prove that, but a series of eddy covariance towers monitoring ecosystems and farmscapes and a variety of practices could really give us real-time information around what's happening in these ecosystems. This is a suggestion we've made to the USDA in a few written pieces, and they seem to be starting to listen. This is just a picture of setting up the eddy covariance tower. The picture on the left is at a conventional farm. The picture on the right is in an organic cornfield, and you can see this is powered by solar, and we also send the data results out by cell phone signal. Every 30 minutes, there's a new reading, and those are sent out so that we can not only store the data on site, but off-site as well. And another tremendous part of our work, I'm going to move a little out of the greenhouse gas area, is how do we affect water? You know, when we think about climate change and agriculture, carbon is sort of in a way the hot topic, and it is very important. And good management of land to sequester and hold carbon usually results in several co-benefits. But in many areas, you know, the water crisis is so powerful that it's hard for many of those practitioners or people in those ecosystems to even think about carbon. So if we think about Montana right now, or California, Colorado, or Mexico, we have to really think about our management of water and all these crop systems I just showed you, how they actually contribute to capturing and holding water, and then also how these cropping systems affect water quality. In places where we don't have a drought crisis, often in those places too, we have a water quality crisis. And industrial agriculture is the primary driver. So we've done quite a bit on measuring this issue, and we use in streams and ditches are adjacent to farm fields, conventional, organic. We've set up a set of tools so we can watch flow volume, velocity, and quality parameters such as dissolved oxygen, dissolved organic matter, pH, temperature, nitrate, ammonium, and also particulates. And this work has been really informative because in our sites where we've brought carbon building regenerative organic practices to the table, we're also bringing much less water is leaving those fields in rain events, and the water that is leaving is much cleaner. And that's been a major observable change that we really should be thinking about when we think about how, again, agricultural land services are managed. And I just want to circle back and say we need to create a system that empowers good practices and good management outcomes, as opposed to disempowering further the producers who are already in these landscapes. It's hard, it's easy to blame them, but it's actually the overall system we've all agreed to that's at fault. Going to go to the next slide here. And this is really, this slide speaks to some of the direction we've really honed in a lot of our work. So the result of our last 8 years of farming has been a certified regenerative organic farm called Stonehouse Farm, and 3 sister farms, Old Mud Creek Farm, the Thorn Farm, and Farm at Miller's Crossing, who all grow grain and graze together in a landscape that was all conventional 8 years ago. Hudson Carbon has measured these changes, and we've now really expanded our measurements and our work into other regions and into really developing tools and interfaces that can work with those in the financial space and the climate space so that we can start thinking through how do we bring funding solutions to these farmscapes that are changing practices and to adjacent ecosystems so that we can really value the intrinsic contribution of these ecosystems and farmscapes, but also specific measurement-based, more intrinsically is biodiversity, the existence of these ecosystems and the whole suite of services, many of which it's pretty difficult to measure. We see there a value there, and that we can use more specific measurements such as carbon, water, species, the presence of species, the increase of species, and the understanding of methane and nitrogen to really actually start to take specific science and measurement values and start to understand their economic value. So to get there, we've had to do a lot more about, thinking about large scale monitoring for change in carbon stocks. So we are doing quite a bit with remote sensing, so GIS technology and drone sensors, and that technology is changing very rapidly. And it's required us to build a lot of mathematical code writing capacities in our and processing capacity in our home base. And then we're also working with how do we, with ourselves internally and with partners, on how we can actually measure soil carbon and changes in it without pulling the soil cores. So we're working with tools that actually scan, use infrared cameras and other types of imagery mounted on a probe that probe the soil and get us readings. So we're calibrating those tools with direct soil cores as one of our core projects now. To give you an idea of how sort of where the future of measurements may be headed this is an example of a tool we have that mounts on farm field equipment. And it measures, it uses an electrical conductivity sensor coupled with a spectrophotometer to measure visual and near infrared reflectance, and also the electrical conductivity of soils. And comparing and combining those factors, it creates a CEC, a cation exchange capacity map, an organic map, and then also starts to develop all these, you can see on the right, these different zones within a landscape. And once we've determined those zones in a landscape, then we can determine areas of interest to then go use our probe and core to go deeper in the soil. And then this type of mapping has informed an even bigger process where we're working with more satellite powered imagery and layered imagery run through algorithms to actually determine where we go test for carbon on large scale landscapes. And we really determined when we moved from a 3,000 acre setting in the Hudson Valley to a 60,000 acre setting in Montana, we realized the first issue we have to tackle is where we actually go test, because we can't possibly test all 60,000 acres in extreme detail. And so this is just a sort of an idea of where we're trying to go at scale to in some of these measurement technologies around. I'm going to move, and here's an idea of when you determine those zones of interest, this probe uses the same sensors, but they actually go down in, instead of skidding the surface of the soil, they go down in, and they give us these more 3D type maps, understanding our cation exchange capacity, our soil carbon, as we go deeper in the soil profile. So we can start to have a 3D understanding of the soils. Right now, our major research is actually everywhere we're taking these probes and surface readings, taking direct measurements of the same soil. So we can cross-check the accuracy of these measurement techniques with specific lab results of the exact same soil. And we feel that it's really going to help us determine which tools amongst our own and some other collaborators really have the most potential to help us move our soil analysis issue out of the lab as we really scale it up. And then this is to be candid, we've moved a bit beyond this technology, but it speaks about some pretty important areas where sensing technology is going. As we really push on the policy and finance and market side and with farmers to see major changes on the landscape, we need bigger solutions to measure and monitor the changes going on, especially if we're going to bring carbon value or ecological system, service value, or even asset value to good practitioners on the landscape. We have to be able to engage at scale. So we've been working with something called solar induced fluorescence. There's some fluorescence sensors now mounted on satellites. We've been using localized ones on fields because this is a byproduct of the activity of photosynthesis. So we've been trying to calibrate changes in SIF to changes in carbon on the ground at our major sites, so we can start to determine if is there a way from the air that we can understand changes in carbon. But there's so many variables, many of them having to do with what type of cropping system. If it's an annual cropping system, then it's very hard to connect solar-induced fluorescence to changes in carbon. But in perennial systems where there's no tillage, the crops are the same every year, this type of technology has the potential to actually start to infer changes in carbon. So, here I've spoken to some of this, and as at Hudson Carbon, we've organized ourselves into two parts. Now the Hudson Carbon Research Foundation as a nonprofit, and Hudson Carbon itself as a B corporation. And we're really figuring out our research is all open source, so we share it with others, not in for-profit. We really feel that we like it being questioned, we like adding to it, we feel it's an important contribution to the space. But we're also building a client-facing business, and also policy side on our nonprofit. So our real focuses are to inform policy decisions designed to incentivize the kinds of agricultural management systems that produce positive environmental externalities. And I would add to that, we want these positive environmental impacts to actually become part of the economic system over time. And that's to the next point. We really want to help our work to help create key ecosystem service market infrastructure in the form of new, scientifically robust, model-based farm planning tools that can accurately quantify land-based offsets. So these can really be counted in the economic equation. We feel that farmers who are using the right practices, and farmers need incentives, not more problems, and farmers have shown that they will respond to what the market conditions are. And I am a farmer, and I think that I've always been able to find the way to do it organically. Most farmers I know want to do new things, but it's always about economic barriers. And it's critical that we find ways to compensate them for environmental stewardship. So I thought I would actually turn off the slideshow. I'm realizing I've taken up a lot of time here and open up to questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. And I think that's a perfect segue to some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A. So I will try to combine a couple of them, and from people who are wondering how difficult has it been to incentivize these farmers to adopt regenerative agricultural practices, and what kind of challenges have you encountered to convince them?
It's a terrific framing of a few questions. I'll do my best to answer it clearly. So it's been very difficult, candidly, because we have not applied enough value to ecosystem services yet. I think a fundamental backing problem is that we don't have an agreed upon carbon price yet. In the European Union, carbon is trading above 90 euros per ton. In the United States, we don't have a price on carbon. And we really, even when we do, we have to think, we don't have at the policy level or the decision-making level, an understanding that we need to think of the carbon cycle as the driver of a carbon market, where carbon underneath our feet is an asset and too much carbon dioxide is a liability. And therefore, from there, you can determine who buyers and sellers are. The beginning of this is happening in voluntary carbon markets, where some corporations and groups that are polluting are trying to offset their efforts by purchasing carbon credits from groups using natural solutions. So groups working in forest, groups working on soils. But it's unfortunately driven a bit of a green rush, where a lot of the primary bad actors, and I'll name a few, they know I'm not a big fan, Cargill, Monsanto, others are all working on what's their carbon solution, which is sort of comical when you think of the barges of soybeans coming out of the Amazon providing Cargill with grain. We need to, so that they're buying carbon credits, or Monsanto's offering discounts to farmers on their products as part of their carbon market scheme. So we have a long ways to go. So where we've addressed this is we've partnered with a group called RFN, the Regenerative Food Network, and a series of other collaborators, because there's an interesting new precedent coming out for something called a natural asset company. Whether that's the right structure or not, I think what we really need to do is think of our ecosystems in our financial equation. This is where the root of the issue. We need to add the value of the services of ecosystems and the services they provide to the heart of our economic thinking. That's a huge proposition, but I also think it's the time is now. I think many groups in finance and investment understand that without a functioning planet, their markets and systems don't work. So we've been having several discussions about how do we create, once we understand BMPs, best management practices, and their outcomes, the outcomes of these, and the measurements, the storage of carbon, the increase of carbon, and how the positive potential there, how can we actually help that become an asset for the steward? We feel that farmers, landowners, foresters, the ecological value of their soils and forests, and if they have used good practices and the impacts on water and biodiversity, should be considered an asset, as opposed to when farmers think of all those things now, it just sounds like a long list of extra costs. So we're working with several groups on some private, using blockchain and NFT technology to help private holders issue ecological assets in a token form, is one goal we're working towards. And another is to, you can look at it publicly in the natural asset company structure that's being promoted by a group called the IEG. I don't know that that's the perfect example, but I think it's a very interesting precedent where you have groups, even the New York Stock Exchange, thinking about this new asset class of ecosystems. And on the other side of the argument is an ethical one. If we've considered, part of this sort of spiritual and social side of ecosystems is they're too good for even be considered for financially. But the problem is that the creation of additional financial capital is driving the destruction of these systems. So we've decided to say, we'll publicly say, we believe we need to find an asset solution for ecosystems. In the meantime, I do represent some clients selling voluntary carbon credits. So we work with a group called B Carbon, and I'm representing a couple of ranches and farms where we're doing their carbon baselines and registering them for carbon offsets and helping them find the highest paid buyers. I feel that until we have a good regulated market and appropriate policy, the best thing we can do in the private sector is to find the buyers willing to pay the highest price and the sellers willing to use the best possible practices and the best possible measurers, which I think we're one of, to measure these changes. I hope those are good answers to this set of questions. And one more thing I'd add is there's precedent, like the Watershed Agriculture Council for New York has been paid for 25 years now to keep New York City's water supply clean. It's one of the only 5 naturally filtered water systems in the world. So that's another example of a market-based structure working.
Thank you, Ben. That is a great answer. And I really appreciate your talks and your work's entire focus on infrastructure, regenerative infrastructure, and asset making, financing, policy, and measurement and so forth. But along those lines, your talk got me thinking about maybe the other end of things, like what's regenerative processing look like? So, you mentioned the thousands of CAFO pigs stuck in sheds, right? And it makes sense why they're stuck there, precisely because a massive scale 20,000 head pork plant needs incredibly uniform animals to just, push those animals through at an incredible rate of throughput. And so I was wondering, you could speculate perhaps, or more than speculate, what, say, a regenerative slaughterhouse looks like, or a regenerative grains processing facility looks like, given how much these farms have been shaped by the infrastructures of killing and processing we have.
This is a terrific question, and it's actually fundamental to building the capacity to farm in a new way, is to build infrastructure that meets scale. So landscapes and watersheds have a specific scale. And the larger and larger our farms have gotten, we've far exceeded the scale of our landscapes and far exceeded the capacity. And we've also have very few people growing food, and we've created food as sort of a cheap underpinning of our economy. Of course, where we pay for it isn't with the world's most expensive healthcare system. But all of this, what I'm pointing back to, is we have a major scale problem in agriculture and the infrastructure to support it. So I've seen many, many times where farmers move to organic practices, but there's no infrastructure, small or medium scale meat processing, grain buyers, grain processing, or produce distribution that's efficient enough to get to eaters in the metropolises nearby at a price that's somewhat comparable to other food prices. We have lots of eaters who want to buy good food and are willing to pay extra for it. But even for them, we have not built appropriately scaled supply chains. Our partners at RFN and at Stonehouse Farm, we did build that middle scale or small scale infrastructure where Stonehouse's grain bins became a feed mill, and we could support 4,000 acres of regional grain. And that supplies 100 small farms in a 100-mile radius. And although we're very lucky in the Hudson Valley, we do have enough small scale slaughterhouses that those farms then bring their chickens and pigs for processing, and then they sell the meat directly to people who eat it. Now that's sort of a lucky Northeast thing, but when we get out to Iowa or Idaho for potatoes, we have to really think, I think, incrementally and at scale. And we're not going to descale these systems overnight. So we really need to start thinking about, well, if we can't change everything of this broken big system, we need to address what aspects of it can while re-envisioning a new one. And I think that many of us in the sector are thinking we need to, at regional scale, bring smaller and appropriate scaled processing to the fore. And then as a country, we actually need to think about the macro problems. How much beef, milk can we really produce within the context of our climate goals? And clear reductions needed. Same thing with things like corn for ethanol or soybeans for export are all issues that we need to think about really hard, because changing those decisions would allow us to go towards a smaller scale and focus on food for us that's safer, cleaner, and more climate friendly. But that critical in some regions like the Northeast, it's ripe for the introduction of small scale meat processing, grain processing, and produce distribution. There's also a ripe interregional opportunity where you can think of areas like the Southeast that are better for year-round grazing and winter vegetables as the deserts dry up. We have to think about regional approaches and appropriate scales. We also have to be realistic that there's a role for a larger scale to play as we bridge through this time. I hope that's a helpful answer, but it's a multifaceted problem. I'm trying to touch on several of the answers.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Alexandra Thorne. I teach GIS and food systems modeling. And I am interested in, you talked a lot about the data collection that Hudson Carbon is doing. And I'm interested in having kind of a sense of some of the numbers that you're getting. And I'm specifically thinking toward the idea of a trade-off between extensification and intensification, or land sharing versus land sparing. I would guess that the systems you're describing are somewhere like that they're much better overall than a traditional farm, conventional farm, but maybe not as good as a natural ecosystem. And how you figure out those trade-offs. Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm excited to do my best answering it. So the trade-offs are a real issue. I think I alluded to a little earlier. I think the first trade-off we need to make is how can we not do as much intensive agriculture? There are a few clear answers. There's ethanol. That's a silly waste of 30-40 million acres. There is soybeans for export, or even the use of soybeans for animal protein. That's a major problem. And there's two issues. When we produce regeneratively, our yields are 20 to 30% lower. So but we do drive in ecosystem services. To give you an example, our average carbon dioxide sequestration per acre across our rotation, growing corn, soybeans, a small grain, and 2 or 3 years of perennial, has been about 4.2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. Not astounding numbers, but pretty good. And we're not emitting, the cover crops emit a small amount of nitrous oxide, but very little compared to nitrogen fertilizer. And also we, especially in the perennial portion, we have much shorter methane flux periods after heavy rain events. But I'm going to try to address the sort of, I think that we first need to strategize, where are we using intensive agriculture that's just producing an excess that's not being used in a wise way? And then on those landscapes, the ideal thing to do ecologically and climate-wise is to return it to, allow it and help it return to a more native ecological context without any agricultural intervention. And then where we do that scale, we do have the scale to produce food for the world regeneratively, but we have a distribution problem. We have a use of, we're using, and we also have a meat problem. We can't eat the amount of meat we are. But I'd say that our approach is we feel that the US could probably reduce about 100 million acres of its intensive agricultural crop land in soy, corn, soybean, wheat. And that land could sort of go the more marginal land should go back really to ecological management. And then we have a major in the remaining croplands that we really can produce our needs here, and some export still from a more less intensive system that has some ecological benefits. But this matrix also is really regional. We have issues like we won't have the water in California and Southern Arizona to grow the majority of our produce much longer. So that's where I argue actually for things like intensification in greenhouses and potential urban farming close to these places where we're eating them, like Boston, like New York City, like Washington, DC, et cetera. So I think there's a real big argument where case by case, we have to be very pragmatic about where do we intensify, say with greenhouse production or even focused high yield agriculture. But in general, how do we free up really critical ecosystems to provide the key services that we need to in terms of water, carbon sequestration, preservation, and enhancement of biodiversity, and really our ongoing fight with invasive species and moving species. I'm trying to pack these answers all together to your very good question, but I feel that the answer is region by region, it's supply chain by supply chain, and we have to be pragmatic all along the way. I don't try to aim to preach a gospel of just one solution, but I try to demonstrate that it's a big part.
Thank you very much, Ben. We're going to have to leave it here, but thank you one more time.